Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. If I could get everyone's attention. I know the whale sharks and belugas are incredibly adorable. Okay. So welcome to the third and last day of the summit. We really appreciate all of you that are still hanging out with us. Thanks for sticking around. We are going to start with the keynote speaker that I'm pretty excited about, but we also have the community track that's going to be happening next door in the Atlantic Ballroom after the keynote. And then there's also going to be the Once program presentation that's happening in this particular ballroom. So please do stick around for those. And then actually after all of those, we have a gaming session in this main room as well. So before we invite our keynote speaker up, I would like to introduce Brad Warren, who's the President and Director of Global Ocean Health. So one thing that I really admire about Brad is that he starts his story growing up picking mussels with his grandparents. And then he noticed by the time he was an adult that many of them were missing, and so he decided to dedicate his life to doing something about it. So Brad actually spent many years as a journalist before he started Global Ocean Health, and I really like Global Ocean Health because they protect marine ecosystems for the communities that rely on them the most. So Brad, will you please join me on stage?
Of course, thank you. Thank you, Courtney.
Thank you so
much. Thank you all. I'm really here because our main program grew up out of decades of working with tribes and other coastal communities who depend on the ocean for food and livelihood and for identity. After about 40 years of working with tribes, I was very fortunate to get to know Fawn Sharp, who is a formidable person. And Indian country has some astonishing, formidable people. Fawn Sharp is 5 terms president of Quinault Indian Nation, currently vice president there, and significantly now president of the National Congress of American Indians. That represents 574 tribal nations around the country. She is 13 for 0 as an attorney before the Supreme Court. And she is a leader in shaping climate policy and comes from an ocean tribe and has a very personal and I think universal message to share about what it takes to grow up this essential work of ocean climate solutions and carbon removal so that it grows up right. Thank you. Fawn Sharp.
Good morning, everybody. What a day to be here on the third and final day, bright and early in the morning. I'm so honored to be here. I arrived last night and got into my hotel about 2-3 o'clock in the morning, and was excited to be here. Thank you, Brad. Can I take this thing off? That's much better. I don't like to stand behind a podium. Is this okay if I come out here? So I got elected in 2006. My first term as president of the Quinault Nation. I was a young 35-year-old. I had never had political experience. That Wednesday, I got elected on a Saturday. On Wednesday, I had to deliver my first testimony before the United States Congress on appropriations. And I just was immediately confronted with the existential threat of climate change. My community is on the front lines. In that first year of office, I found out about things like ocean acidification. I found out about things of the spikes in the ocean temperature warming. I took a helicopter flight and saw that our Anderson Glacier that feeds the mighty Quinault River completely gone, disappeared. And so in my first year in office as an elected official, I learned about all of these things related to climate change. And of course, back in 2006, I couldn't really have a substantive conversation with anyone. I remember raising the issue of climate change at conferences locally, and the room would get quiet, and then someone would change the subject and we would move on. I had those kind of conversations at the regional level, at the national level. So finally in 2008, I decided I'm going to have to go outside of the United States if I want to have a substantive conversation. And so for the first time, the Quinault Nation participated in COP14 in Poznan, Poland. And it was there I realized there wasn't much political will in the United States to go after the resources that I knew were minimally necessary to defend the Quinault Nation, to restore our salmon. Back in the 50s and 60s, we had millions of sockeye salmon in the Quinault River. The year I got elected in 2006, we only had 3,000. And these are prized salmon. And you can see this in this image. That's where the Quinault River meets the mighty Pacific Ocean. And you can see our fishermen. We've fished in this river for tens of thousands of years, from the beginning of time, from time immemorial. And I recall as a young kid seeing boats like the one you see just loaded with prize sockeye salmon. And trip after trip, we would see our fishermen come back with absolutely nothing. And so as a young child, it deeply affected me quite profoundly. And that's why I went to law school to become an attorney. And my grandfather told me, Fawn, a law degree is a social tool, it's a political tool, and it's an economic tool. And I want to sort of set the stage for what's on the horizon, because I believe in the next 20 years, the work that we've done at a policy level, tribal nations in leading not only in fisheries management, natural resource management, but in passing the most aggressive climate policy in U.S. history, the Climate Commitment Act. We held industry accountable. We've priced carbon, and just in the last month, we realized $689 million, new dollars into the Washington State Treasury to do the restoration work that we know is necessary. And as a young leader attending COP14, I realized we're not going to get the resources. And as epic as the Inflation Reduction Act is right now, tribes have secured $500 million. That's $500 million for 574 tribes. You divide that, it's less than $1 million for tribal nations. And we're on the front lines. We're disproportionately impacted, and we have little to no resources. So while we co-led the most aggressive climate policy in the United States, holding industry accountable, pricing carbon, and securing the resources, we know we're just at the beginning, and we have to continue to do this work globally and internationally. And so I want to just take a moment to pause and thank everyone in this room, because of the important work that you're doing. No matter what sector you're coming from, you realize the value of the ocean, and you realize the value of what it means to not only our survival and sustainability, but as we are taught as Native people to look generations out. When I think about the next 7 generations, how are we going to confront this crisis? The ocean is critical, it's key. And from our teachings at Quinault, our ocean is our relative, and we have to care diligently for the ocean. And that's the mindset that tribal nations have brought to the conversation, not only here in the United States, but internationally. And I just want to give you a couple of examples of that work. 2 years ago, actually it was just over a year ago, at COP26 in Scotland, John Kerry, who is, we call him the SPEC, a Special Presidential Envoy on Climate, he had asked us to organize a high-level meeting between the United States and Indigenous leaders around the world. In 50 minutes, we were able to collaborate with Indigenous leaders from Africa, from Southeast Asia, from the Amazon, from Northern Siberia. And for many of these elders in Indigenous communities in other parts of the world, they have never had a chance to sit down directly with the United States. But tribal nations here in this country have political structure. We have a bilateral and multilateral relationship with the U.S., and we have standing to bring the interests of 500 million Indigenous peoples globally directly to the table with the United States and offer timeless solutions. And so I want to just emphasize that point, that as the United States takes up the mantle to lead the world, not only in climate policy, but in basic human and civil rights, respecting the vision, the timeless knowledge and wisdom that Indigenous peoples have, not only here in the United States, but in other parts of the world. Because in many other places, for example, people who are defending the Amazon, they live day in, day out, risking life and death just to advance interests to protect the Amazon. and they don't have political champions. Oftentimes they're relying on NGOs or others to help defend their interests. But we find that when we can come to the table and stand, and I often say people might think of Indigenous peoples as, we're vulnerable, we're weak, we're on the front lines, we have little to no resources. That's all true, but there's a flip side of that. We might appear to be weak and vulnerable, but to the contrary, we're strong. We have ancient and timeless knowledge and wisdom that the world is starting to recognize is absolutely necessary and vital if we're going to solve and confront this challenge. When John Kerry addressed the National Congress of American Indians 2 years ago, he said the future of humanity and the planet is inextricably tied to Indigenous leaders, not only having a seat at the table, but leading. And so we've taken up that call to action, and across the world, we are looking and building partnerships. And we know the work is still, there's so much to do. And one of the things that we are targeting in this upcoming year is creating a global public-private finance entity, because we find that there are so many intermediaries. They'll use pictures, they'll use our image, they'll secure funding, but then they often act against our interests, or they're not implementing things that are consistent with our vision. And so we know that there's trillions of dollars that are being deployed across the world, both in the public and private sector. Those entities know the value of Indigenous peoples, and we want to be able to create an investment, because those that work directly with tribal nations know you can invest with us and take it to the bank. You know we're going to restore salmon. You know we're going to value water as a sacred resource. You know we're going to repatriate and clean up lands, clean up the ocean, utilize the ocean, and let nothing go to waste. Every bit of what we do, we see value in it, and there is no margin of error. Time is of the essence. And so I just wanted to make a couple of those comments that are related to the value and the vision that Indigenous peoples bring. If you could look back centuries and millennia of timeless ancient knowledge and wisdom, and the vision that so much of innovation is uncovering, and they're finding that emerging and best practices are Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge. And so there's a foundation that we all have to consider and we all have to respect. And even as a tribal leader in present day, every single day it seems like I'm discovering and finding footprints of those like Billy Frank and Terry Williams and others, things they taught me as a child that didn't make sense then, but it makes all the sense in the world now. And they had this vision and ability to see long into the future, as well as way back in the past. I often joke that Billy Frank seemed to be a tribal leader that he spoke so wisely. I often wondered if he was around at treaty time when our treaties were signed 150 years ago. And Terry, a significant mentor of mine as well. And we know that we have an honored gift. And our ancestors foretold of a day of reckoning when the world was not going to be sustainable. It's on a trajectory that is simply not sustainable. And we have to go back to those teachings. And I know that the trajectory that we all vision in this room and other thought leaders in other places around the world, we see a bright, prosperous, clean, healthy, sustainable future. We all have a role in this, and we all have gifts and talents and skills to bring to the table. And so I just want to say how valuable it is for tribal nations to not only be welcomed in these spaces, but to share and learn and have an exchange of information, because so much of what we do is incredibly powerful. It's valuable, and when we all come to the table and we all start to consider our collective future, there's so much value that we can share and exchange, and it's truly inspiring. And so I often find myself in these various pockets of policy, various pockets of our economics, and trying to build our economies and raise ourselves out of centuries of oppression and injustice. And I just know that there's a future that we all see, and we all see it together. And so while tribal nations co-led the Climate Commitment Act in the state of Washington, and as I said, We just received our first auction, and it was $689 million. We saw that value not only for us to restore our salmon, but all of the state of Washington. And we're finding that non-tribal citizens, when we stop things like Bakken crude oil being shipped out of our ancestral territories, in the absence of political leadership, our surrounding community could see there's leadership within tribal nations. And we have bold and not only bold political courage, but moral standing, because it's in us. It's not something we do as a career. It's something that's deeply embedded in us. We're taught. It's a way of life. I cannot imagine being an elected official and not taking a bold position when I know it's necessary to protect our ocean, to protect our marine life and in our forests. And these are simply things that are just so ingrained in us. And I know each and every one of you in the work that you do, you find that passion. And there are moments where there's tons of work and it seems impossible. There are days where, how are we possibly going to confront this? But then you have those moments where you meet somebody and you find an inspiration in spaces like this. And so from the bottom of my heart, I am truly honored and grateful to be able to come to the table and share our knowledge, wisdom, and experience, our bold, aggressive agenda that we've been able to overcome seemingly impossible challenges. This last year, we had our blueback returned at a record rate since our first state of emergency. And so I have hope, I have optimism. And when we look at the next generation of leaders coming up, I know many of you have probably heard young people speak. There's no question our future is in good hands. And I just want to leave you with that last thought that our leadership must be seamless. And so I would encourage each and every one of you not only to reach out and work with tribal nations, and tap into that timeless knowledge and wisdom that we all carry, but also honor some of the teachings. And we're taught to bring up the next generation. Just as Terry saw me as a young 5-year-old who wandered in and out of meetings with my mom, he saw something in me and he took the time to talk to me. Billy Frank Jr., who saw a kid, and as a 4-year-old, I had friends who played with Barbies, but my hero was Billy Frank Jr., and I grew up knowing him, and he saw the spark in my eye and the fire in my heart, and he raised me as well as Terry. And so I would encourage each and every one of you, when you see these young people, take just a moment of time to see what they have and raise them, so that a 15-year-old now in 10 years is going to be a college graduate. They're going to be dealing with this long after we're gone. It's going to be that generation that implements and executes the vision that we're creating. So with intention, with strategy, and with heart, follow the footsteps of those that have led our way as Indigenous peoples and tribal leaders. And I can attest, I've now been doing this work, even though I'm 52 years old, I've been doing this work for 5 decades, thanks to people like Terry Williams and Billy. So I highly encourage you to reach out to tribal nations, look at the vision that we have, follow some of the teachings, and just take the time to get to know us. We stand ready to work with each and every one of you. Siakwil, thank you.
I'm going to seed a question for you. There is time for a few. Can you tell us about free, prior, informed consent?
Yes. Thank you. Free, prior, and informed consent. I'm going to put this up here.
You have one last slide that will be useful to show.
This is quite an image. You can see I'm standing off to the right in a traditional cedar hat and a cape. So we have tribal journeys in the Pacific Northwest, and we had a visionary elder who saw that our canoes would once again return to the ocean. And during the time when we were hosting in 2013 at the Quinault Nation, it was a pretty exciting time when I served as president. How many have heard of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? So we have quite a few. That's a good number. So when the UN adopted UNDRIP in 2007, 4 countries opposed it: Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States. The three other countries reversed their position, and in 2010, I was asked to introduce President Obama to tribal leaders at the White House Tribal Nations Summit, and they told me I'd have 5 minutes in the back room, and I had a 5-minute speech plan to encourage the United States to adopt the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and I heard in the background somebody thank the president, and he was just about to go out publicly to announce the U.S. was going to reverse its position. But inside the declaration, there's a principle called free, prior, and informed consent. And what that basically means is that tribal nations have an inherent authority to make decisions freely as it respects to their land, territories, and resources without another sovereign taking unilateral action over our objection. The classic example is the Dakota Access Pipeline. That's an example where there is no consultation, let alone consent, and even over the objection of not only the Standing Rock tribe, but tribes across the United States proceeded with unilateral action to install a pipeline where in other parts of the county it seemed to be a health risk and a hazard. So let's just route it through a tribal reservation, right? And so over the objection, so that's an example where tribes have an inherent authority to have a decisive say on our land, territories, resources, and people. And when President Obama announced the U.S. was going to embrace the declaration, he issued a memo and said, we need to lead the world on implementation. And so in 2 weeks, I have a meeting with the U.S. State Department at the UN Permanent Forum in New York, and we're going to exchange ideas. We have a vision of how the United States can lead the world on implementation, and it's a pretty straightforward vision. And we're going to sit down and hear what the United States has. But I think it's an opportunity for tribal nations, as John Kerry recognized, for the United States to join in partnership with us to lead the world on not only climate policy, but basic human and civil rights, where others around the world are risking life and death, just to stand up and have a voice to protect those things that they're related to, whether it is the Amazon or the ocean. And so that's free, prior, and informed consent.
We do have time for one or two questions. Thank you for being here. And Fawn, thank you for coming. Fawn got in at 3 in the morning. Her schedule is relentless. Do we have questions? Comments? Please, come join.
Oh, now it's on.
There you go.
Hi, I'm Annie. I'm an early career scientist looking to get into this ocean climate space in a little more applied sense. And I think as scientists, we've had a moment of reckoning about actually co-creation of knowledge with Indigenous groups. And I was just wondering if you had any recommendations on how to really engage with tribal leaders or just members of the tribe to actually do informed science as we progress.
Yes, excellent question. Thank you. We do have a number of intertribal organizations. I would encourage you to look up the National Congress of American Indians. We're going to hold our mid-year session at Shakopee in Michigan here in June, and our entire mid-year is going to be focused on environment and sustainability. We have an invite out to John Kerry. We have diplomats from other countries who are going to be joining us. In January, I was invited to the World Economic Forum in Davos. I had a conversation with Klaus Schwab, the founder and CEO, and I found out why for this year the WEF wanted to invite Indigenous peoples, and he made the comment that after 50 years of working at a very high level, a global level, with policy, with economics, with social injustices around the world, he's come to the conclusion that the only remaining citizens of the planet who have a truly holistic view are Indigenous peoples. And so we are going to be having an exchange where not only tribal leaders go to Davos to engage with the global business community to look at the new and emerging businesses on the horizon, but the associated policies. We are inviting CEOs around the world to come out to Indian country to meet us in Indian country and learn, because when you do business with tribal nations, You're not going to walk into a boardroom that's very sterile with accountants and lawyers. You're going to be engaging with tribal leaders that bring a unique perspective that transcends this generation. And so I would encourage you to go to events like that. If you just go onto the National Congress of American Indians website, you'll find a link to this mid-year, and that's a target-rich environment for you to have those type of conversations and exchanges. And you'll meet global business leaders, you're going to meet diplomats, you're going to meet indigenous peoples from other continents all in one place, and we're bringing everyone together in preparation for this year's COP that's going to be convened in Dubai.
Thank you. Any more? We might have time for one. Otherwise, we'll call it and let this show move on.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm very short, so I have to pull this down.
I am too.
So following up on that, how do we ensure that the science that's done, both social and natural science, isn't extractive? And in particular, do you recommend implementing both the fair data practice, but also care? So, and its collective benefit, authority, responsibility, and ethics is what care is.
Yes, absolutely. Another question I really appreciate. Leading up to the Climate Commitment Act, we co-led a citizen initiative in the state of Washington. It was called I-1631. And outside fossil fuel interests spent $33 million to kill that campaign, and we lost it just by a few percentage points. We were able to bring each one of the tribal provisions back, aggressively passing the Climate Commitment Act. But one of the central policies we had in both 1631 and the Climate Commitment Act was a tight nexus between the investment and actually doing things on the ground that work, and we found data is critically important. And as we look at creating a gold standard for investment with the trillions of dollars that's going to be invested between now and 2050, we are reaching out to ensure that we have both qualitative and quantitative data, because we know investors are now being sued by their shareholders for not managing their assets against climate risk. We know NASDAQ now has a rating for climate risk. And so we know investors are looking for entities that have a long history. They're not just pop-ups. You could look at tribal nations. We've been here for centuries. And they also want to know there's a tight nexus between the precious few dollars we have and actually doing things that work on the ground. And so we are building both qualitative and quantitative data sets, as well as being aggressive in holding the scientific community accountable when we do see things that are up for sale and up for grabs. We have no problem, and we have no political baggage that holds us back from not calling out those things that are not right, that are being sold. Because we're looking out not only for our interests, but certainly as we do, investors and those who provide the very limited resources and its precious funding. And so when I talked about creating a global public-private finance entity, that's another critical part of that. And we've reached out to a number of colleges and universities because I want to demonstrate 10 years from now, when you made an investment with a tribal nation back in 2023, we could concretely prove and show and establish a long history of proving results, but results that you could both quantify and qualify. And so there is that assurance, because we want to know we're doing the right thing, but we know there's a lot of eyes around the world, a lot of money that's being spent, and we have to accurately, as Billy Frank always said, tell our story and tell it in a way in which there's some honesty, truth, transparency, but ultimately proven results. Because that next generation, when they're going to be looking at what did we do over the 10 years, they're going to want to know what worked, what didn't work, and those things that did work, how can we enhance it and continue to do the work of the generation that went before us. So excellent question. We absolutely value that, and we'll continue to hold that high standard of having good quality data that's true and honest and credible. Incredible. Oh, 3 hours of sleep. I feel good. Thank you. Siakwea, thank you.
And who's up next?